Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IRR briefing. South Africa seems to be on the cusp of a new political era as we are about to enter an age very likely of coalitions. Now, we still don't know what the results of the 2024 national and provincial elections will be. However, the polling suggests that we are going to enter an era where we are going to see coalitions not just at a provincial level, but also possibly at a national level. Analyzing some of the consequences of this is Terence Corrigan, who is here with us today, who is going to be talking a little bit about what a potential coalition between the ANC and EFF might look like. What kind of policies would they pursue? What would sort of be the style of their politics? That kind of thing. So, Terence, thank you very much for coming here today to talk to us, and also this paper that you've written. I give it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think that we are at the end there. Let me. Can we get the? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks to everyone for joining. First of all, just let me say that I'm suffering from a bout of flu, so if I break into a paroxysm of coughing or sneezing, just bear with me. Okay. A big question that has been raised with us by many concerned people across South Africa. These are ordinary South Africans, also people in the business community, in the diplomatic corps, overseas journalists. Is the question of what what South Africa in a coalition-dominated future would be like, and all of this, or a lot of this, revolves around an immediate question of what would be the fate of the country should this coalition be between the ANC and the EFF. Now, before I begin, I just want to emphasize something. In discussing this, we are not suggesting that this is a likely or still less an inevitable future. We are not here to engage in any sort of scaremongering, but this is a matter of legitimate interest, and it has been raised. The Democratic Alliance has called this the Doomsday Coalition, but for those who may be inclined to dismiss that as politicking, I think it's also important to point out that commentators like Melanie Verwoerd and Adrian Basson, neither of whom I would regard as being particularly sympathetic to the DA, in fact, I'd say fairly hostile, have raised concerns about this course of action. So what I'm going to unpack here is a possible future and what might possibly unfold. Now, why have I given it the term a question of fate? Because I think there is something in our political culture that is, very fatalistic, that sees South Africa as being on railroad tracks of history. We often look for the doomsday option, or for the Messiah to lead us out of it. And for a reason which I will elaborate on towards the end, I've chosen this as the title. This presentation is based on a report which we're releasing today, and for those interested in a potted essay of what I'm discussing, you can go to the Daily Friend, our news website, and have a look at the which draws on the paper which has been published today. Okay, so there are seven phases to what I'm about to discuss. The first is to look at the ideological underpinnings. And I think this is very important. It seems to me that if there is going to be a hookup between the ANC and the EFF, ideology and a shared worldview will be a major driving force. The second one is concerns the conditions in the country, the societal crisis, as I call it. Then I will look at two expressions of a populist an ANC-EFF coalition, and I will do this through the lens of populism. I will discuss this in some depth. First, I'll talk about the economy, and then I will talk about what this will mean for the politics, the constitutions, and the institutions of South Africa. And then I'll get on to a conclusion, and I will invite questions. Please note you can leave questions in the comment section. The first thing to understand is that both the ANC and the EFF consider themselves liberation movements and not political parties. This is very, very important because in a normal, stable democracy, politics is conducted through parties. The idea is that they offer a suite of values, of policies, and they invite and encourage people to support them. A liberation movement is different. A liberation movement historically is an organization that arises where there are where there's what is termed national oppression. Typically in the sense of colonial domination in Asia and Africa. In South Africa's case, it had to do with the struggle against white minority domination. Their initial goal is to achieve independence, or in the case of South Africa, a kind of regime change. But their broader objective is to reconfigure society comprehensively. And it's very important to understand that they have a particular self-perception and self-conception of themselves. They represent society as a whole, not just a specific political faction. In a mature, stable democracy, political parties will generally acknowledge that their appeals resonate with middle-class, working-class people, with the wealthier, or that they appeal to people with a particular interest in, let's say, societal freedom, or people who are concerned about, let's say, education or healthcare. This isn't the way a national liberation movement views itself. It represents the kind of authentic soul of the nation, and this is why the phrase "the people" is so important. When President Ramaphosa refers to our people, or the people, as intended to be in the 1990s, he's referring to a set of multi-class, heterogeneous social forces. But what he's saying is that these are the people who kind of matter, whose interests need to be foregrounded, and quite possibly to the exclusion of the interests of others. Other parties or other factions represent sectional interests, and what they have to say should not be viewed as legitimate in the same way that that the positioning of a liberation movement is. Now, there is a certain resulting entitlement that comes out of it. There's a right to power, and the key concept here is what the ANC terms hegemony, the unchallenged leadership position. And to the extent that there are other parties or other factions within society, the appropriate position of these groups is to operate as supplicants to the liberation movement. They may be accepted as representing a sort of quasi-legitimate sectional interest, the former oppressors or whatever, who may be accepted as part of the society, but their interests may only be considered to the extent that the liberation movement is prepared to concede that. Now, both the ANC and the EFF consider themselves liberation movements. This is, I believe, actually to this day, the ANC has this on their website, South Africa's Liberation Movement. It's very clear. The EFF, when it broke away, it deliberately chose that phrase, freedom fighters, to plug into the idea that it was the new liberation movement. Both of them have this view that they represent a kind of mass vanguard, which is somewhat contradictory idea, but is, I think, a decent way to understand their position, that they have a unique entitlement to set the agenda for the country, and that those who stand outside somehow represent unacceptable compromises. The EFF actually throws this very much at the ANC. that the ANC has compromised the white monopoly capital, that whereas the ANC will talk about the DA, a party like the DA, as being enthralled to the imperialists, who want to take South Africa back to bondage. A party like the IFP might be seen as a reactionary, backward nationalist movement, etc., etc., etc. Understand that ideology; it's very important. Now, in times of crises, strange things can happen. This is a truth throughout history. I don't think we would have got Hitler, Mussolini, the Russian Revolution, had we not had things like the First World War, the depressions, hyperinflation, etc., etc. Now, South Africa has, for some years, been facing what can only be described as a polycrisis, a series of interrelated crises that the country is increasingly unable to deal with. Now, the graphic here helps to put that into perspective. This is South Africa's GDP per capita. In other words, the value of goods and services divided by the number of people in South Africa. And it's ranked against the world average. The world average is given a nominal value of 100. And what we see here is that in 1994, right at the beginning, South Africa was almost bang on the world average, 99%. As we went through the first half of the post-transition society, there was a dip. We had the Asian financial crisis. There was a lot of adjustment that needed to be made. It's often forgotten, for instance, that the state in 1994 was, to all intents and purposes, bankrupt. By about 2007, 2008, however, we were bang on that 100 again. South Africa was actually doing quite well, and those who can think back to that time, will remember new malls going up. There was a booming, confident, and happy middle class that was emerging. South Africa was doing well. Well, what happened then? Well, two things really. First of all, externally, there was the global financial crisis that was associated with the subprime loan debacle in the United States, and then also the accumulated failings of South African governance. Now, much of this had gone back to decisions that had been made in the 1990s. For instance, the failure to construct a properly fit for purpose and professional state administration. When I said think about the ideology, the drive for hegemony, cadre deployment, and as you enter this period, the state simply became less and less able to fulfill its responsibilities, and we are now sitting in a situation that South Africa's GDP per capita sits at about 3/4 of the world's average. In other words, there's been a precipitous decline. South Africa is, by sort of any measure, failing. It's seen in the state of electricity supply, in the state of our infrastructure. Although we've been given a reprieve of sorts, we should see what happens afterwards. Unemployment sitting at between 30 and 40%, depending on what on which measure you want to use. Economic growth would need to, in order to start really making a dent in unemployment and getting South Africa moving, would need to be in the region of about 5-6%. Yet over that whole period, there's only about 3 years when we've managed that. So what this produces is not only a sense of frustration, hopelessness, and despondency, but also questioning the very foundations of society. This is what political scientists might call the crisis of representation. Right. Now, the framework through which I think we can view what might happen is to look at the concept of populism. Now, populism is a phrase that is much used, but I think very little understood. Someone like Jacob Zuma is often described as a populist. Julius Malema is described as a populist. When the DA put posters up in Phoenix about the community that defended its turf, that was seen as a populist gesture. And I think we often throw this around as a kind of metaphor for unsophisticated or pandering politics, but there's something more substantial to it. Conceptually, at its base, populism is about conceptualizing society as a kind of unbridgeable divide between the people and the elite. Now, remember, I mentioned the people earlier. Well, this is what we're talking about. The people, the ordinary salt of the earth folk, those who have been excluded, those who are not given their due and included in the economic bounties, and they're being constantly done over by by the wealthy, by white monopoly capital, by an out of touch political class. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but for our purposes, this suffices. What does this mean? Well, in political terms, it trends towards a zero-sum worldview. If I get something, you have to lose something. If you get something, I have to lose something, and that is very much the way that that populists try and structure their appeals. This is not about win-win solutions. This is about you have done something bad to me, and I'm coming to regain my losses. For a society like South Africa, where we do have very stark divides between the rich and poor, we do have a very painful history. This kind of understanding, does have fertile ground. Populism often takes the form of charismatic leaders who align themselves with the people. Someone like Jacob Zuma did this very well. Think of speaking to his people in Zulu. The ridiculing clever blacks and dog owners, and talking about how the white man's way is not the African way. Elites, outsiders, they're all portrayed as part of the problem. The populism often takes the form of class-based resentments, against the middle class, against the wealthy, also perhaps against foreigners, against people who don't belong, against minority ethnic groups. And in economic terms, generally speaking, economic policy focuses on rapid gains for the base. In other words, it says, well, our supporters have been done out of the riches of the society. What we are going to do is make sure that that they get their fair share. Redistribution is generally at the heart of this. Where there is a natural resource, whether it's oil in Venezuela or mineral resources in South Africa, that often becomes the kind of fulcrum around which this goes. That God has endowed this country with this enormous wealth, and it's time to share it. A lot of resentment is often directed at things like foreign investors who are supposedly looting the country. Populists have a tendency to want to spend. Populism is not an ideology or not an approach to politics that is about waiting. It's about saying, we want it and we want it now. So how would this play out? Well, two scholars in the early 90s, Rudiger Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards, wrote a book called The Macroeconomics of Populism in Latin America. Latin America is the continent in which the study of populism, really gained its momentum. And they proposed that the populist approach to economics could be seen would unfold in four phases. Okay, the first one, beg your pardon, involves redistributing resources and stimulating economic activity. Often this involves the payment of social security, perhaps giving subsidies to companies. You're trying to utilize idle capacity. In other words, if a factory could take on more people, well, you maybe try to subsidize that. You start to spend your reserves, your foreign capital. You start to expand your budget deficit. you introduce things like expanded labor programs. You basically start to dole out the goodies. Now, for a while, this will seem to work because often the productive capacity of an economy is such that it can absorb these additional demands. And for a while, things seem to be going great. I remember that in the early 2000s, there were many people who would look at Venezuela and say, "Wow, they've got it sorted. They've taken the oil revenues and they've plowed it into healthcare, um, into social welfare payments, even setting up heavily subsidized supermarkets where you could buy goods that 40% at a 40% a reduction than you would find in a commercially managed one." And there was a documentary at the time, very sympathetic to what was happening there, that spoke of this as another world being possible. Another world is possible in Venezuela. So yeah, that's how it might go for a year or two. And now in the second phase, problems start to arise. What's happened by then is that reserves are depleted, demands for goods rise, there's shortages, there's inflation, you're trying to import things, but you lack the foreign exchange. But the budget deficit starts to grow unsustainably. But the government still has political control, so what it will try to do is to deal with these problems in political terms. The most obvious thing is price control. So in other words, it says to firms that they may not hike their prices. Okay, and there'll be a great deal of sympathy because remember, this is playing on the idea of us and them. And if these supermarkets are making astronomical profits, which is generally the way it's phrased, surely they can take a smaller profit or no profit at all for the greater good. This, however, has its limits, and these become become manifest very easy, very quickly. Okay, so in the third phase, the economic failures become obvious, and the big thing here is that countries tend to face problems with inflation. We've seen the pain that this has caused with inflation rates of 5-6%. Here, but by this time you're talking sort of 20%. There just isn't enough money. There's the government is maybe trying to print its way out of trouble. Living standards start to decline. Traditional fixtures like hiking minimum wages and subsidies are introduced with great fanfare, but they're not working because the productive base of the economy is eroding. The problem, of course, is that the government is still conceptualizing this in very much in economic terms, or in very much in political terms. So it will try to make these it will try to resolve these problems by executive action and by legislation, but it's not working. Firms are just shutting down. Those who can are taking their money and they're leaving. Skills are departing. We've seen this in Zimbabwe. We've seen this in Venezuela. And it becomes a case of if you have an aspiration to maintain your kind of middle class standard of living, you may not be thinking of immigrating to the United States. Maybe you're simply trying to jump across the border. Countries like Colombia received a great many immigrants from Venezuela. One could imagine the same sort of thing starting to happen here vis-a-vis Namibia or Botswana. Although I imagine that if South Africa were to go in this direction, those countries would be hit hard themselves very soon. Now, in the fourth phase, the cumulative damage becomes such that runaway inflation, social discontent means that the problem simply can't be denied and they can't be dealt with. So the incumbent government starts to look for a way out. And often this is done via approaching an organization like the IMF, asking for a bailout, effectively loses control of its sovereignty, and living standards and the potential of that country to recover is severely degraded. You are then faced with the uphill battle of trying to put yourself together from a very, very degraded base. So, conceivably, how could this unfold? Well, I would imagine, and you can, I would encourage anybody interested to have a look at the paper. The early government period would be characterized by more of the same, essentially. Investigations into proposed intervention. We've already seen things like the NHI signed into law, free education, which the EFF promises. These sort of things would move very strongly onto the agenda. But my sense of it is that initially the ANC would, as a party that has retained power for 3 decades, would probably be sensitive enough to global concerns to want to probably retain a steady hand at the tiller. So expect not much change in the finance ministry, and that would provide some reassurance. But I think what you would see is rising spending and deteriorating fiscal base. This will become this already is a major concern, and this would become increasingly so. This would be justified, I think, by saying, well, don't worry, when we achieve takeoff, we'll be able to pay down the debt. We've seen in the ANC's manifesto, they talk about prescribed assets. In other words, South Africa has massive pots of pension money which they'd want to access, and this would then be plowed into things like rolling out the NHI. There would be promises that this is going to be done on a responsible basis, that these are actually investments, not consumption. Unfortunately, I think that the potential for that would be rather undercut by the fact that the ANC and the EFF have also pledged to continue with the empowerment policies that have meant that government business generally comes at a large premium. Now, done honestly, this still implies fairly stiff premiums being added onto the cost of goods and services, and expect this in the NHI. You're talking about hundreds of billions rands worth of spending, onto which you can graft the new public procurement regulations, which mandate preferential procurement, which implies large premiums. But the problem is that much of the state has been compromised. There are criminal entities that operate within it, and I think would be quite eager to get their hands on some of the spend. So you are looking at a great deal of money being essentially fruitlessly and wastefully and quite possibly illegally spent. The other thing is, I think that after a couple of years, the firm hand at the tiller, the conservative finance minister who might survive the initial part of the government, would be replaced by someone in sync with the new government's ideological outlook. The EFF, for instance, has said that their only demand be that Floyd Shivambu becomes the finance minister, and I suspect that while the ANC would resist this initially, they might well find themselves in a position where they were compelled to concede it, or someone from their own RET faction. More money is printed. There is actually a theory that is that has some beachhead in government, called new monetary theory, which holds that provided your debts are denominated in your own currency, a state cannot go bankrupt. The idea basically is that as long as everything is in rands, you can simply run the printing presses and print your way out of trouble. I've personally heard this advocated. There are some deep thinkers who have done so. This was a solution that has been particularly prominent since the COVID pandemic, and I suspect that as the fiscal situation becomes more and more dire, this would be, in a sense, the last gasp. Simply print money and hope that this solves the problem. I think the reality is simply would be massive inflation. This is the 20, 30, 40%. This erodes living standards, and this will also make those welfare transfers unsustainable. People might be getting social grants that are now in the region of 50,000 Rand a month, but that simply won't take you very far. The economic base would become increasingly unstable and unsustainable. And this is what produces the populist crisis. The real economy is simply not working, and the government wants a political fix to it. I think by this stage, what you probably also have is a great deal of dissatisfaction amongst those directly linked to the state, civil servants, politically connected business people, and they would probably their interest, I think, would be satisfied by a lurch into sort of outright criminality. Here you're talking about things like factory seizures, land invasions, etc. I think what remains of South Africa's economy by this stage will be entirely extractive in terms of, you mining, for instance, would possibly survive, but that's only because the minerals are here, and only to the extent that they can be pulled out. There would be a sort of flood of people exiting the country, and many others who are able to simply trying to take their assets offshore. What does this mean, though? What does this mean for the character of our democracy? All right. Well, we have a massive economic crisis. Populists generally distrust and disregard mediating institutions. This means things like courts, like constitutions, things that tell them what they can't do. Populists like to be able to act freely and act without restraints, and this is justified by the fact that they are acting for the people. In a way, populism is kind of radically democratic, and particularly if you go back to the etymology of the word democracy, the power of the people, this is what populists claim to embody. So what I think you would see here is that, particularly as the socioeconomic system declines, there would be attempts by some within civil society, by business, by think tanks to try and hold some of the more insane ideas. And I think that this would be met with a more aggressive liberationist politics, the idea that it's us against you, and we will do whatever it takes to maintain to retain our hold on power. What I could foresee happening in that situation is, for instance, you would have the government organizing very large street demonstrations outside the offices of recalcitrant companies, or social media campaigns targeting cheeky NGOs. And I think what we could see here is that under these circumstances, the incumbent government would be willing to abandon the legitimacy that constitutional governance gives it in order to retain its hard power. I think that what it would probably find this a lot more difficult than fiddling with the economics of the country, because a government like this would face significant resistance from organizations from activist groups, which let's say would be, well, I would term to be broadly within the ANC's WhatsApp group up to this point. But organizations that have invoked the constitution on things like healthcare. You think about a group like Section 27 or the Treatment Action Campaign. And I think that there are many people within the EFF and the ANC, precisely because they are viewed as populists and anti-constitutionalists, would be severely distrusted. So I think that there would be a significant degree of pushback. I think you would also see business awaking from its inherent conservatism and reluctance to get involved, because I think it would see the actions of this government as potentially being well, the doomsday scenario, if you like. So, what can we take away from it? Well, if we look at populist governments around the world, particularly those that have embarked on a sort of macroeconomic populist path, they have generally produced poverty and misery, democratic decline, and this has been able to do great damage to the institutions and the trajectories of countries that were at one stage considered fairly stable. I think here of Venezuela. I think here of Zimbabwe. I'm old enough to remember the 1980s, where I think perhaps incorrectly, given what we know about the actions of the Zimbabwean government at that time, it was nonetheless seen as a state that was getting itself on its feet and behaving with responsibility and fortitude. But I would say, though, that South Africa does have a number of things going for it that would push back against this. First of all, we're a free society, and sometimes that's almost anarchic. South Africans, as someone once said to me, don't like to be oppressed, and I think that is the case whether the oppressor comes wearing a red beret or driving a yellow Casper. We have a multi-party system. I don't think it has always been adequately used in its accountability function, but nevertheless, we have seen changes of government. We have a diverse and often cantankerous media, which sometimes gets it right, sometimes gets it wrong. But the point is, a media that is able to speak. The same goes for civil society, and the same goes for our judiciary, which, with some wobbles, is respected across the world. All of these, I think, are factors that would allow South Africa to push back. I would also like to point out that nothing that I've said here should be construed as a prediction. In as much as we are as forewarned as forearmed, and in as much as one should be wary of the dangers posed by reckless or counter-constitutional courses of action, it's well to remember that there have been examples of circumstances in which ascendant governments defied expectations. One that I like to use is the case of Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, who came to power through a coup and was viewed, who came screaming blood and hellfire and proclaiming Marxism as the solution. And although I'm certainly not endorsing this, was able to pilot Ghana through some very, very difficult reforms. One never knows. My question for South Africa, though, is: if faced with this challenge, will South Africans ready to defend their democracy and the freedom of all? And hence the title of my talk, the question of fate. Those of you who have watched the Terminator franchise will know this. There is no fate but what we make for ourselves. And I think this is the case that South Africa faces now and into the years ahead. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let us start off with a question about the relationship between the EFF and the ANC in practice. You talk a lot about, these kind of points at which the worldview of these parties is aligned. As you mentioned at the beginning, the they're both liberation movements. We've already, however, had some practical test runs of what this relationship might look like in practice in some of the metros, Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, and such. Do you think that has any lessons to teach us? In Ekurhuleni, for example, the ANC and EFF coalition almost broke apart. It did actually for a while. They replaced a mayor. A similar thing seems to have happened in Joburg, although it was much less contentious and the relations between the two parties seemed better. What lessons do you think we can take away from those in practice as to what this coalition might look like?
Okay, well, I think first of all, my sense of it is that this is not an arrangement the ANC would like. I know that there are certain ideologues, including in our provincial cabinet, provincial executive council, who are quite warm to it, but I don't think that's general in the sense because both the ANC and the EFF view themselves as that kind of, and there's a strange irony here. Both of them view themselves as embodying this unique legitimacy. But in a sense, only one of them can really have it. So neither of them would like to concede it to the other. So I think that already sets them up for conflict. Secondly, politics is a dirty game, particularly when it's bound up with questions of extraction and patronage, and each has patrons and supporters that they'd like to keep sweet. So I think the problem with the shrinking pie is that there's only so much you can redistribute. So yeah, yes, the fact that they have the same worldview may, in a sense, actually start to act as a disincentive. There was a phrase the late Friedrich von Slubbert once used when talking about the relationship between the ANC and the IFP, and he said, "But each wants to be the bull in the kraal." And I think that there is something like this that goes on with the EFF and the ANC. I think in the EFF's case, they understand that as much as they may consider themselves South Africa's liberation movement, they are well aware that the ANC's brand has greater purchase, and I think what they would hope for is some sort of unity deal, which would see them in a position to perform a reverse takeover. I think that there are many within the ANC who are well aware of that and would not like to concede it. And yes, I think that when faced with that, in reality, as you point out in the metros in Gauteng, that relationship is extremely fraught. So, for those who are concerned about this as a likely outcome, I would say that a great deal of water has to run under the bridge. The reason that I want to emphasize, the reason that we wrote this is not is not as a prediction, but to address the concerns around it, and to try and provide a sort of roadmap to how it might unfold. But yes, I do not believe it is the most likely outcome, but it is a possible one.
So another question here: what is likely to happen with the police and army? Both are very degraded. Would they have the stomach or money to do what is necessary to keep power by force?
Well, funny that you say that. I think there's two things. First of all, South Africa's military has no tradition of interfering in the state. We're not like Nigeria. We're not like Thailand. So I don't see that as a particular threat. I remember the second point is that, and this goes back to something I remember hearing in the 1990s at a seminar put on by the Institute for Security Studies, where the speaker said, "Look, The reality of it is that the army has been degraded to the point that it doesn't pose a threat of intervention. It doesn't have the resources, the reach, the capability to do that. The problem, I think, really is that neither of them are professional, to the point that they can adequately fulfill their mandates. And this is what we kind of see with failures around crime fighting. I suspect that with that, if there was some sort of lurch into authoritarianism, which I don't think that this is this is necessarily on the cards, even in a populist even in a kind of populist future. I think that they would want to keep the parliament and keep elections. I think that I'm not sure just how valuable an asset these these institutions would be. I suspect that there'd be some reticence about trying to involve the army in politics, because there would be a concern that this becomes that this becomes a Frankenstein you can't control Frankenstein's monster you can't control very much, as it is in Zimbabwe. As for the police, I think the danger is more that they increasingly become suborned by and penetrated by criminal interests. So if we reach a point, let's say 10 years down the line, where large crowds are assembling outside the union buildings to protest, yes, maybe the police will kind of enforce the law, and maybe they will open fire. We've seen that sort of thing in Marikana, for instance. But I don't see them being in a position to sort of stem the flow of a mass movement.
So one of the questions here is, in Germany, a coalition is governed by an agreement between all parties involved, which is legal and unbreakable for the period as initially agreed. In SA, a coalition is a very wishy-washy thing, which can be changed at a whim. How could it ever possibly work?
Well, look, I think that's a big question. I think someone like our colleague Marius Root would be best placed to answer that. Yes, you're quite correct. We've certainly seen coalitions being collapsed in Gauteng, and elsewhere. I think this is another reason why the ANC would be reticent about throwing in its lot with the EFF, because I think that the EFF has kind of established a reputation for itself as thriving on chaos. I think the EFF has a funny split personality, or at least I think it's demonstrated one in the past election campaign. On the one hand, it wants to be a protest movement. It wants to be a populist. We're sticking it to white monopoly capital. On the other hand, it wants to kind of be a government in waiting. And it's like, well, which is it? You can't do both. And I think that the ANC would, I think, be very concerned about being in a position where it could be toppled at any time. That's why my own preference would be for a kind of confidence and supply arrangement with the DA. But to answer the question from our viewer, I would say that the issue to be addressed there, it's a much bigger one, and we'll have to it is something that may partly be regulated by legislation, which has been discussed. For instance, limiting the number of no confidence motions that can be introduced. In some of these councils that became an every week phenomenon. But I think it's also going to be about shifting South Africa's political culture to the idea that rival parties will have to learn to work with each other. And I think there's a particular difficulty here for the ANC and the EFF, and also I see someone mentioned MK, because of the way they view themselves. That they don't see themselves as, I'm no more legitimate to occupy a seat in the DA. I'm just like a bigger party. More people have voted for me. It's, well, I am the soul of the nation. I think we have to sort of start to. I think that as a matter of urgency, that has to be jettisoned entirely.
So there's a question here: how would the national balance of power be affected by an MK-EFF coalition in KZN, and more broadly, might we see what effects would sort of provincial arrangements have? Do you think on a national coalition?
Yeah, that's another big question. It may be, for instance, that that these could be traded off. A confidence and supply arrangement, for instance, says that we will support we will not join government, but we will give our block of votes to kind of guarantee its continuity. In other words, we won't join a no confidence motion, and we'll vote for your budgets. On everything else, we're not interested. Now, perhaps the DA and the ANC could come to some arrangement. Well, the DA will do that in national parliament. The ANC will do that for the DA in Gauteng or the multi-party coalition or something like that. On MK, I think MK is far more explicit than the EFF. It sort of announced right at the beginning, well, we had to save the ANC. So I think they very much want a beachhead, and they want to use that to negotiate their way back in, or at least to protect certain former presidents of this country facing legal challenges. I think that MK has proven a large problem for the EFF, because I think that if you want that kind of ideological politics, EFF gives it to you in a very pure form, but it also gives it to many South Africans in a much more traditionalist and well mannered form. And I think that has greater purchase. Don't forget that that Zuma is in many quarters an extremely popular figure, much more so than Julius Malema. I would be very hesitant to say though that the ANC could do a deal with MK. I think that there is just too much about it that smacks of fighting an internal ANC battle at the cost of ANC unity, which is kind of the eighth deadly sin, for the ANC's worldview. But if it is a reality, it would of course influence their behavior. My own intuition, though, is that it would probably incline them to perhaps seek an accommodation with a kind of non-liberation movement organization, the IFP, the DA, or something like that. As I say, simply because I think that MK's objective is a takeover of the ANC, and I think that is something that they would be and also there's a lot of bad blood between them. It's been festering since 2017. So I think that would be a very, very difficult arrangement to make work.
So there's a question here which sort of follows on what you were saying earlier about legislative remedies to coalition problems. And the question reads, is it not time to introduce a legal framework in the Constitution to enhance the coalition agreements made to make it more legally enforceable?
Look, I think that's an excellent question. I don't think you would need to change the Constitution, but I do think you would need legislation around it. So I think we South Africans often have this view that if something is important, we must have it in our Constitution. That's why we put a lot of stuff into our Constitution, why a lot of people get disappointed. But yeah, look, I mean, I think that if that this is where we're going. And my own view, I think, in fact, I've said this in writing, is that people criticizing the DA, well, why can't you get a majority? I just don't think that I don't think that sort of result is going to be available Not for the DA, not for the ANC. I think maybe 30-40% might be as good as it gets, and 40% might be the outside of single party support. So yes, I do think that we need to very seriously consider, what our viewers is suggesting. I think that things like legally enforceable coalition agreements, limits to votes of no confidence, perhaps also electoral thresholds. Although I'm torn on that one. I think it would really depend on where you kind of set that threshold. At the moment, if you get 0.25% of the vote, you can you get into parliament. I think in councils it sort of varies, but the point to be made there is that you can end up with an exceptionally small amount of support being exceptionally influential. I think it's good though to have voices that may otherwise be alienated within the institutions, but it's not great for stability, and that's a debate that needs to be held. But yes, I think in principle, I'm 100% there. I think the question is exactly what are those conditions that we're going to set out.
So there's two questions here, which I think I'm going to take together as our final questions, and they're I think related to each other. The one question is, what do you think of the concept of this idea of a government of national unity? I presume probably between the ANC and DA, but it also, I suppose, could be between other parties as well. And also, will the DA form a coalition with the ANC?
Okay. GNU. This is an interesting option, which I think is surprisingly under discussed, because I think that if the ANC does dip below 50%, this could be the solution that allows it to kind of save a lot of face and save some of its reputation. It has been in a GNU before, and what it could say here is, we are going to put South Africans first. We are going to all come together, and we are going to bless you. We are going to, work as a collective. This is bigger than any of us. You can spin this with some remarkable verbiage, and I think with some justification. Also, it is a very popular idea if you look at polling. Most South Africans, care much, would much rather have a government that quote unquote works than a government that is ideologically pure. South Africans are, in that sense, very pragmatic, and this is something that feeding into the question: would the DA go for this? Well, okay, I think a government of national unity would allow the ANC to say, well, we're going to bring everyone significant in. So that would, let's say, the DA, the EFF, and ourselves. I think the big stumbling block would be what do you do with MK? Because I don't think they would want MK in there. That would become a problem. But bringing them all in, I think that there'd certainly be a lot of pressure from the business community to do this, because I think they would assume that the more pragmatic and sort of closer to the center parties, the DA and the ANC, would be able to form a bloc that would be able to resist, the radical economic transformation types. I don't think, though, that accounts for ideological impulses and also for sheer careerism. People within the ANC might think that this is a time where they can do their reverse takeover. I would say, though, that whether this is viable would really depend on what is in people's hearts. Now, that's not an adequate answer, but it's the best one that I can give. I think it would be a case of, well, if this is about ensuring my longevity and playing for time, no, I think it would be a disastrous thing to happen. If this is actually, all hands on deck, we are now in a crisis, and we acknowledge that we're in a crisis, and we admit to some of the things that we have done that have brought us to this point. And I think unless from the ANC's point of view, I think the only sign of that would be this: will they forthrightly abandon cadre deployment? Say, we admit this was unconstitutional, illegal. It has killed the civil service from now on, merit only. If they're willing to do that, then I think there's something to discuss. Will the DA form a coalition with the ANC? The DA, I think, is in a very difficult position. If the ANC, let's say, falls to 40%, and it's a choice between going with, they can't pull a coalition together from the smaller parties, and effectively becomes, do you go with the EFF MK side or with the DA? The DA supporters, I think, would kind of damn them for either option. That's why the DA can't write it off entirely. So would they do it as a least worst option? Yes. My advice, my suggestion to the DA is that don't go anywhere near it unless they are given the finance ministry, because I think that is one area where there is a great deal of professionalism in the state, and where they could actually have a real impact. However, the idea is, well, they can have education and the Ministry of Sport and whatever, a combination of the irrelevant and the beds of nails, and you can't control the money. Then I think that they will be stuck with having to be co-responsible for things that they cannot really co-govern, and that'll be deeply problematic for them. But yeah, if we're in a situation in 5 years' time where you do have an ANC-EFF coalition, their supporters will probably hate them as much for not having taken the gap. So I don't think they can win either way, and that is a conundrum. Would they? I think, but to answer with a straight binary, I think yes, they would possibly do it. I don't think. Once again, I think this is a question of, it's not likely. What I would suggest is rather offer the confidence and supply thing, perhaps even with a trade-off. The ANC will support the DA in Gauteng and give them certain key positions in the legislature in exchange for, pardon me, in exchange for support to govern at national level.
All right. Thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much, Terence, for your excellent presentation here today. Please do check out the full report at irr.org.za. You can read it there with all the details it has. Very important question. We're going to, I think, get, of course, some clarity on it by the end of this week when we start to see the results of the national election. And then everything is up for grabs. It's going to be an interesting couple of weeks in South African politics and society. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.